Good morning, congregation. Today I'll be reading Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 to 6, 13 to 14, 17, 22 to 28, and lastly, 30. I'll be reading in Latin, as Pastor Justin said. Baltasar rex fecit grande conviviam optimatibus suis mili, et unis quisque secundum suam bibebat aetatem, praecipit ergo iam tumultuus, ut afferenter vasa aurea, et argenta, quae asportaverat Nabucodonosor, pater eius de templo, quod fuit in Jerusalem. Ut biberent in eis rex, et optimates eius, uxuresque eius, et concubinae, tunca lata sunt, vasa aurea, et argenta, quae asportaverat de templo, quod fuerat in Jerusalem, et biberent in eis rex, et optimates eius, uxores et concubinae ilius. Bibebant vinam et laudabant Deos, suos aureos et argentos, aureos, ferreos, ligneosque et lapideos. In eadem hora appareurent digiti quasi manus hominibus, scribentis contra candelabrum in superficie parites, aulae regiae, et rex aspiciebat articulos manus scribentis. Tunc facies regis commutata est, et cogitationes eius conturbabant eum, et compages regnum eius solvebantur, et genua eius at se in vicem collidebantur. Igitur introductus est Daniel, coram rege ad quem praefatus rex ait. Tu est Daniel de filiis captivatis Judae, quem adduxit pater meus rex de Judea? Audivi de te, quoniam spiritum deorum habeas, et scientia intelligentiaque ac sapientiae ampliores inventae sunt in te, ad quae respondens Daniel, ait, coram rege, munera tuas in tibi, et dona domus tuae alteri da, scripturam autem legam tibi, rex, et interpretationem eius ostendam tibi. Tu quoque filius eius Baltasar, non humulasti cor tuum, cum scires haec omnia, sed ad versum dominatorum caeli elevatus es, et vasa domus eius alata sunt coram te. Et tu, et optimates tui, et uxores tuae, et concubinae tuae, vinam bibistis in eis. Deus quoque argentos, et aureos, et aereos, et ferreos, liginosque, et lapideos, qui non vident, neque audient, neque sentient, laudasti, poro Deum qui habet flatum tuum in manu, sua et omnes vias tuas non glorificasti. Id circo abeo, missus est articulus manus, quae scripsit hoc quod exartum est. Haec est autem scriptura, quae digita est, mane, thecel, fares. Et haec est interpretatione sermones, mane, numerat Deus regnum tuum et complevit illid, thecel, appensus est in startera, et inventus est minus habens, fares, divisum est regnum tuum, et datum est medis, et persis. Eadem nocte interfectus est Baltasar rex Chaldeus.
Nice. Put on that stand over. I'm going to be preaching in Latin. We are continuing in our sermon series, Strangers and Sovereigns. And we've been in the book of Daniel for a few weeks now. And one of the ways that actually you can read the book of Daniel is that it's really a story about the God of the sovereigns facing down the God of the strangers. So it's the God of empires. What happens when they encounter the God of the exiles? And all the stories that we've looked at, we've seen some version of that showdown, and always in the middle of it has been Daniel and his companions. And today, I think we get to see one of the most dramatic showdown between the gods of Babylon and the God of Israel. But before we dive into the text, let me give you a little bit of context. If you were here with us last week, we heard about the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, between Daniel 4 and Daniel 5, at least 20 years has passed. Somewhere between 20 and 30 years has passed. Nebuchadnezzar has now passed away, and now it's his grandson, Belshazzar, who is now the emperor of Babylon. The text refers to Nebuchadnezzar as his father, which is really just a way of saying my ancestor, but it really is his grandson. And the night where all the events just happened with the finger and the wall and the banquet, all those things, that night would end up being the very last night that the empire of Babylon existed. The greatest empire the world had ever seen on the face of the earth was about to fall that same night. And what Belshazzar knows is that right at the gates of his capital city, Babylon, the armies of the Medes and the Persians are already charging the gates. And most of the major cities in the Babylonian Empire have already fallen in battle and have been taken over and conquered by the Medes and by the Persians. In fact, Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus, who was kind of his co-regent, he has already fled the city. Like, he knew it was all going down tonight. And he fled the city, and in the midst of all of this, with the armies of the enemies at the gate, here is Belshazzar giving this extravagant banquet. It says 1,000 nobles, and on top of that, their wives and concubines and who knows how many others. A couple of thousand people now at the palace, and he's throwing the biggest party you had ever seen. His empire is on the brink of disaster, and Belshazzar is toasting his own greatness. We see a picture of a ruler who's completely and utterly out of touch with reality. And one of the great ironies of this text is that Belshazzar is a name that means Bel, which is the name of the Babylonian god. It means Bel, protect the king. And here's a king who sees himself as untouchable because he believes he's so perfectly protected. And in the room will come Daniel. If you remember, his Babylonian name was Belteshazzar, which means Bel, protect his life. Which God's going to win? Who will do the protecting? That's the dramatic scene that has been set up for us. And the real shocker of this text is that it's the God of the exiles. It's the God who was defeated and humiliated by the gods of Babylon. It's the God of the people who have been enslaved and occupied for decades and a generation at this point. It is the God of the weak and the humiliated that ultimately defeats the gods of the greatest superpower the world had ever seen. He pronounces words of judgment on the heights of worldly power. And so let's ask the question, what does a text like this in ancient Babylon have to teach us today in East Harlem? And I think the answer actually is quite a lot. So let's look at that. We'll use three headings to take us through the text. First, I want to look at the gods of gold. Secondly, we'll consider the humbling of kings. And then lastly, we'll look at the finger of God. Okay? So first, let's look at the gods of gold. If you could pull up verses 1 through 4 there. I will read this in English for those of you who didn't understand the Latin. Pull up 1 through 4. Daniel 5, 1 through 4. Here's what it says. It says, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the kings and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the kings and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. And as they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. If you were listening carefully or reading along carefully as it was read to us, you may have noticed how the imagery of gold and money actually runs through the entire story. From the first verse all the way to the last, we are immersed in this imagery of money. So right from the beginning, we just saw it here in verse 2, he commands the people to bring in these goblets of gold and silver. And you would imagine that the wine that a Babylonian empire offers people at this big banquet is not the cheap stuff. And so this opulent setting of being in the king's palace, goblets of gold and silver, the best wine you could possibly imagine. And then if you look at verse 4, not only do they drink wine, not only they're surrounded by this wealth and affluence and opulence, as they drank wine, what do? They praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. What the ancients knew that you and I as modern people are far too naive to is they knew that behind the things we treasure lurks a false god. And so they sat in this room and they're surrounded by this gold, and so they praise and they worship the gods of gold and silver. They don't just treasure the gold, they worship it. A good thing has become an ultimate thing. The things that they love has started to enslave. And then if you go to verse 7, which wasn't on one of the screens, so Hannah, you don't have to frantically look around for that. But verse 7, by the time the vision has come to Belshazzar, now what happens is he sees this vision, he's terrified, his knees grow weak, his face grows pale, and now he needs someone to help him. And so he's looking around and he needs somebody's help. For the first time, he feels vulnerable and he needs somebody else to help him. And do you notice what Belshazzar does? What does he use to try to get someone to help him? He uses money and wealth. He says, I'll give you expensive clothing. I'll give you gold. I'll give you power. I'll give you standing in my empire. And all the characters in the story is moved around like pawn pieces by the love of money. It's as if the gods of gold are controlling everything in this text. It's as if money rules every single character in this passage. It's a little bit like what our modern day prophet and theologians, the Wu-Tang Clan, used to say when they said, cash rules everything around me. Get the money. Dollar bills, y'all. Cash rules everything around me. We see this picture where every character is moved effortlessly by the offer of wealth. The gods of gold come calling, and all the people line up. The wise men and the astrologers, the educated, the wealthy, everybody lines up hoping that they might catch their big break. Money has a spell on everybody in this story. And even when you get towards the end, verse 25, when you get to the writing on the wall, you and I probably wouldn't know this, but the words written on the wall are mene, mene, tekel, parsin, which if you don't know are actually Babylonian words or Semitic words, and they are all different denominations of Babylonian currency. It's like it says dollar bills, y'all, but in Babylonian. Like that's what's written on the wall. And so here is this picture where even the words of judgment, even the words of the one true living God, comes in the language of money. It was language that could be understood by those who worship the gods of gold. Every single person is controlled by money, but Belshazzar was by far the most deceived. He thought his money would protect the king. And it thought it made him invincible. It thought it made him untouchable. And so he throws this banquet on the night when his empire would fall. So now, what does this mean to you and to me in 2026 in East Harlem? Well, I think it tells us this. It tells us that the greatest threat to our spiritual lives is not dancing, drinking, and smoking. The greatest threat to our spiritual lives is not even spiritual warfare and the forces of evil. The greatest threat to our spiritual lives is not losing some sort of culture war that we believe that we're in. The greatest threat to our spiritual lives isn't even the problem of suffering. that you and I often wrestle with. What the text is telling us is that the greatest threat to your spiritual life is wealth. It's money. It's affluence. And in fact, there was no prophet who spoke about this more clearly than Jesus of Nazareth. Remember the things that he said? He said it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter in the kingdom of God. We would prefer to metaphoricalize that. And yet here's what Jesus said. Or in his Sermon on the Mount, what does he say? He says, most clearly, one cannot serve both God and money. Or in 1 Timothy chapter 6, where he says that money is the root of all kinds of evil. Or even you look at some of the stories that Jesus told, the parable of the sower, it's wealth and the things of this world that choke out the seed. Or you have the story, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. You have all of these stories where time and time again, Jesus is trying to tell us that the greatest threat to your spiritual life is going to be your wealth. There was an article in the Atlantic magazine, and it was entitled, What I Learned About Billionaires at Jeff Bezos' Private Retreat. And so the writer is a fairly famous film writer, I think TV show writer, and he got invited to a private retreat hosted by Jeff Bezos. And the first question he asked is, why did I get invited to this private retreat? And he shares all the stories. I won't go into all the details, but ultimately gets flown out to the place, and the whole place to themselves. They got Michelin star chefs that are doing all the food. They apparently hired nannies for each child. And they're spending the entire weekend together. And during that weekend, here's how the author reflects. Here's what he notices during that weekend together. He says, the closer I've gotten to the world of wealth, the more I understand that being truly rich doesn't just mean amassing a lot of money. It means that everything becomes effectively free. Because for soon-to-be trillionaires, no level of loss could significantly change anything. For them, the word failure has ceased to mean anything. And then he continues, this sense of invulnerability has deep psychological ramifications. I would take the word psychological out there and put in spiritual. This sense of invulnerability has deep spiritual ramifications. If everything is free and nothing matters, then the world and other people exist only to be acted upon. When you can buy your way out of any mistake, when you can fire anyone who disagrees with you, when your social circle consists entirely of people who need something from you, the basic mechanism by which humans learn that other people are real goes dark. And then he says this, they float in a sensory deprivation tank the size of the planet, in which their actions are only ever judged by themselves. Money has this power to distort reality itself. Now let me say this, it's easy to pick on billionaires. It's easy to pick on Babylonian empire builders. But for you and me, if you're a billionaire in the room, you've just heard what I had to say to you. For the rest of you who may not be billionaires, this passage actually speaks to you as well, because remember, it's not just Belshazzar who's controlled by money. Every character in that room jumps when money calls. You don't have to own $1 billion to worship and be controlled by $1 billion. Let me give you an example. Let's think about the problem of greed. Okay, so the sin of greed. If you were to ask yourself, who is guilty of the sin of greed? Chances are you would name all the people who happen to make slightly more than you do. They're the greedy ones. For me, I give thanks with what I have. I try to be comfortable, but I try to live modestly. But these folks, are the greedy. See, that's the problem or the power of the gods of money. With every other sin, you know exactly when you've sinned. Adultery, you know exactly when you've committed adultery. It's never unclear to you. Stealing, murder, you know the exact moment when you committed the sin. What is the exact moment when you've become greedy? It's probably one more dollar in your mind. And yet everybody in this story comes jumping when the gods of gold call them. Or let me maybe give you another example. In the world that you and I live in, we're just immersed in this world. Envy, the sin of envy, has become a virtue because envy is what sells product. Greed has become a virtue because greed is what keeps our economy growing. Lust has become a virtue because lust is what makes you a loyal customer. Gluttony is a virtue because gluttony means you will always want more. Sloth has become a virtue because it means that you'll let Netflix just go to the next episode. Wrath has become a virtue because it keeps us glued to our screens. That you and I are in the middle of a realm that is ruled by the gods of gold. And I'm actually convinced that the gods of gold are now back with a vengeance, and they're actually far more powerful today for the simple fact that we don't believe in gods anymore. Everybody in this story, controlled by the gods of gold. It's easy to judge the billionaires and the Babylonian emperors. But you and I, we're all under its spell. It is the greatest threat to our spiritual life. Let me move on to the second point. So that's one, the gods of gold. Second, let's look at the humbling of kings. Because what I love about this story is in the midst of that big banquet hall, along comes Daniel. And he's the only one who's free. Did you notice that? And what we know about Daniel, so let's read maybe verses 13 and 14 just to refresh our memories where we are in the story there. But Daniel comes on the scene, and it says, So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to them, Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? Next verse. I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have great wisdom, insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. Verse 17, Then Daniel answered the king, But you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to something else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Now, here's what I love about this picture. By now, Daniel is probably about 80 years old. So I like to imagine in this bacchanalian scene, this banquet of opulence, an 80-year-old man kind of slowly walks in. It's kind of like a movie where there's all this stuff going on, and someone walks in and takes him forever to get to the front of the throne. So here comes Daniel kind of hobbling. He's probably frail. He's hobbling forward. I kind of imagine him like that Clint Eastwood meme where he's just kind of angry at everybody. He's just cranky the entire time. And he makes it to the front of that throne room. And actually, even Daniel being there, he'd been completely forgotten by Belshazzar and all of his rulers. Because the text that we had to leave out, because there's just so much passage here, but the text that we had to leave out, it was actually his queen mother who told him, actually, there was this guy back in the day who used to interpret dreams. I wonder if that guy's still around. And so she's the one who tells Belshazzar about this guy Daniel. And so here he is, old, frail, cranky, get off my lawn kind of old man. And he gets to the front. And remember, Daniel is the prophet of the defeated and humiliated God of Israel. And he's coming to the throne room of the powerful and victorious gods of Babylon. And Daniel comes up to that throne, and he looks the emperor in the eye, and he says, You have not been humbled before the God of the universe. It is absolutely stunning to me. Daniel is the only one that the emperor can't control. The emperor has offered money and robes and power and standing, and Daniel says, you can keep all of it. I don't have use for any of that stuff. It has no power over me. Now here's the question, friends. What would it take for you to live with that kind of freedom? To walk into a room and be the only one that is free from the very things that controls others. Christian, what would you have to be able to see and believe and experience and know? What would have to be the most real thing to you in order for you to live with that kind of freedom? Well, actually, Daniel tells us in a little bit of an indirect way, but he tells us, if you go to verse 23 there, he's talking to King Belshazzar. You got it, Hannah. You can get there. Verse 23. Oh, yeah, all right, there you go, thank you. So here he's talking to Belshazzar, and he says, have not humbled yourself, though you knew everything that happened to your father, our grandfather. He said, instead, he says, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets of his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles and your wives and concubines drank wine from them. Next slide. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. What was Daniel's secret? You see, the Bible teaches that if you are not worshiping the one true God, you will worship something. And if you're not worshiping the one true God, you are worshiping a created thing. And if you're worshiping a created thing, you inevitably become controlled by a thing you were never meant to be controlled by. And for Daniel, he says, the secret to my freedom, the reason why the emperor and the gold and the money has no power over me is because I worship the one true and living God. And it has completely set me free. So here's Daniel, comes to Belshazzar, comes to you and me today, and says, listen, if you would choose this day to worship the God who holds his life in your hands, you'll be set free. You'll be more yourself than ever before. You will finally come alive because you were never meant to worship a created thing. Do you know him? Do you know the one true and living God? And so Daniel, the prophet of the defeated and humiliated God, tells the most powerful man in the world, it's the God of Israel who holds his hand in your life, or his life in your hands. And then he goes to the writing on the wall. Maybe pull up verse 25. There it is already. He goes to the writing on the wall. He says, you want to know what these words mean? Let me tell you what they mean. So the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Next slide. Here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And here's what's fascinating. If you were in that room, all you would have seen was currency. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. It's like quarter, nickel, dime. Like that's all you would have seen on the wall. And the king would have seen those words. I'm like, yeah, we worship the God of gold. We worship the God of money. And here comes Daniel, and he says, let me tell you what this means. And he says, mene. Mene is a word that simply means numbered, which is why it was their currency. You number things. He says, mene means numbered. It means your days are numbered. Tekel means to weigh on a scale, to weigh precious metals on a scale to see their value. Tekel, it means that you've been weighed on the scales of justice and you've been found wanting. Perez is kind of like a $50. It means half or divided. Perez means that your kingdom is going to be torn in two and be given to the Medes and to the Persians. And what I love here is that the God of Israel, the one true God, speaks the language of the gods of gold. And he turns the language of the gods of gold that probably would have been assumed to be blessings, and he turns them into words of judgment. And it's a complete reversal. Now here's what this means for you and for me. Friends, you will one day face this writing on the wall. Not one of us escapes the writing on the wall. There is a day coming when you might walk in just as confident as Belshazzar. And you might be throwing a party because you've done so well in life. But every single one of us will face the day when we will have to look this writing on the wall, eye to eye and face to face. And there's a day coming when, like Belshazzar, our face will grow pale and our knees will go weak. Because God will tell us, Mene, your days are numbered. Last I checked, life is a terminal condition. If you've seen online a little bit, Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse has been talking about his pancreatic cancer journey and how he's basically going to be dead, likely before the end of this year. And he's sharing about that, and ultimately what Ben Sasse in those interviews says, advanced pancreatic is nasty stuff, it's a death sentence. But I already had a death sentence before last week too. We all do. Mene, numbered. Are you ready for that? Secondly, tekel. You will be weighed on the scales of judgment. And if you're honest, and if I'm honest, you will be found lacking. Every day of your life will be weighed on the scales of justice, and you will be found lacking. Tekel. Parson. Everything that you worshiped and gave your life to will be torn in two. It will all be shattered, and will all be lost. The writing on the wall is not just for Belshazzar. It's what awaits you and me at the end of our lives. Are you ready to face that day? Now let me say this. Some of you are here, and you're like, man, I haven't been to church in a long time. This was not the message I was hoping to hear at church today. And I hear you, and you might even say, this is why I don't want to believe in a God of judgment anymore. And I'm like, I hear you. I feel that actually very, very deeply. But here's the problem. If there's no judgment for many Belshazzars like you and for me, then there's no judgment for actual Belshazzars who dominate and oppress and destroy. If there is no judgment from God, there is no ultimate hope for justice. All that we're left with are the cycles of retribution and grievance and retaliation. And so it's actually incredibly good news that from the real Belshazzars to many Belshazzars, there's a day coming when we will see the writing on the wall. If there is a God, there's an accounting and there's a reckoning. And that has to be for all of us. It's not just for the people up here. It's got to be for us all. That's the second point. Let me move on. So we looked at the gods of gold. Secondly, we looked at the humbling of kings. Third and finally, let's look at the finger of God. What I love about this passage, if you look at verse 5 and 6, it says that this human finger shows up. And that finger, right, verse 5, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand of the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote, and then his face goes pale, his knees go weak. But I love this imagery of the finger because what it tells me is this. It says that the God of the exiles can topple empires with just a flick of a finger. That God barely lifts a finger and entire dynasties come crashing down. And what I love about this is, did you know that there are only 3 places in the Bible where we see God having a finger? Only 3 places where we see the finger of God. The first time we see the finger of God is in the giving of the 10 Commandments, Exodus and Deuteronomy. And what we see there is we see the finger of God blazing the law of God into stone. And it's dramatic, and it's beautiful, and it's moving. The second time we see the finger of God, so it's the finger of the law in Exodus. The second time we see the finger of God is here in the book of Daniel, and it's a finger of God appearing, and it's blazing words in stone again, and this time it is the words of judgment. The words of the law, words of judgment. You know the third time we see the finger of God? It's all the way in John chapter 8. A woman is caught in adultery. And by the way, if you're caught in adultery, there needed to be a man who was also caught in adultery. But somehow he gets off scot-free. But the woman is caught in adultery. And the Pharisees and the teachers of the law bring this woman to Jesus. And they know the law says this woman was caught in adultery, and the law says she must be stoned. And I imagine all of them picking up their choice stone. They've had it picked out and ready to go. And they walk with the stones, and they bring her to Jesus. And he says, Jesus, what should we do with this woman? And Jesus, instead of looking at him, it says he bends down, and with his finger, he begins to write in the dust. And the Pharisees and the teachers say, Jesus, what should we do with this woman caught in adultery? And Jesus, without even looking up, simply says, let him who has no sin cast the first stone. And I can imagine silence coming over that angry mob. And I imagine one by one, maybe starting with the oldest of the Pharisees down to the youngest, they each begin to drop their stones on the ground. So thud, 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 thud. And after a while, it gets silent again, and Jesus looks up. And he says to the woman, where'd they all go? Have they not condemned you? She says, no. Then he says these incredible words, neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin. The one person who was qualified to pass judgment on the woman, the one person who was without sin and therefore could cast the first stone, Jesus says, neither do I condemn you. Do you see what has happened? The finger of the law, the finger of judgment, has become the finger of incredible mercy. To hear him say to you, neither do I condemn you. That Jesus Christ changes the writing on your wall. That Jesus, the one whose days were never numbered, takes the word mene into his body, and he dies the death we should have died. Jesus Christ, who was heavy with glory and perfect justice, takes the word tekel and chooses to be weighed on the scales of justice and to be found wanting because of you and because of me. Parson, Jesus, who is the eternal Son of God, who holds the entire cosmos together, torn in two for you and for me. Friends, it's only the sacrifice of Jesus that can take the words of the perfect law and the words of perfect justice and make it the words of perfect mercy. Look, today, if you turn away from the gods of gold, and if you say, I trust in this Jesus, the writing on your wall changes instantly. And all it says is forgiven, beloved, embraced. Friends, give your life to him. I don't care how many times you've given your life to him. Do it again today. That's why we come to the table. We come to the table to eat at this king. It's like the polar opposite of the banquet of Belshazzar. We come to this humble table of a poor man who is the king of the universe. And we say, I give my life to you all over again. Stop chasing the gods of gold come to him. Let's pray. Lord, we want to be free like Daniel. I know I'm not. We want to have that kind of courage, that boldness. We lament the ways that we find ourselves enmeshed in a world where the gods of gold have come back with a vengeance. It's so easy to judge the billionaires and the Babylonian kings, but it's really our way of trying to avoid our own judgment of ourselves. And so, Lord, I ask that you'd guide us now as we take a few moments in a prayer of confession. Lord, show us where the gods of gold have started to move us around like pawns. Show us where we have lost our freedom. And show us, O Lord, your glory, the one who holds our life and all of our ways in your hands. And help us to return to you now. So, Lord, hear us now as we confess our sins in the quiet of our hearts.